thank you very much. You've doubtless all heard that the Great Barrier Reef is on its last legs, and it's been smothered by sediment, polluted by fertiliser and pesticides, and it's killed by dredging and, of course, climate change. So who here, put your hands up, believes that story is true as a matter of interest? Right. Well, that's interesting. So, I mean, out there, almost everybody believes it true. There's literally hundreds of millions of people around the world who think that. So you guys now have got a little bit of a tricky question, because you've been told it's dead and you believe it's dead. So how are you going to tell this? Am I a whistleblower, and the world has been conned, or am I a complete lunatic? And of course, the way you decide is that you'll listen to my arguments, that this is the libertarian way. But unfortunately, that's not the way of a modern university, as we will see in a minute. So I'll give you, before we go into my little tricky situation with the university, I'll give you some facts about the reef. Climate change is supposed to be killing all the corals, but did you know that most of the corals that live on the Great Barrier Reef also live in Indonesia and Thailand, where the water is 1 or 2 degrees hotter, and they actually grow 50% faster there, in fact probably more. Coral bleaching, which you've heard such a lot about, is not a new phenomenon. It's been going on for 100 million years or so. It's like a bushfire. It looks terrible, but the corals rapidly recover from it. You would have heard statistics like 1/3 of the reef has died in the 2016 mass bleaching event. Well, actually, when you look at the statistics in a great deal of detail, and you've got to dig deep, I can tell you, you find that probably about 5% of the coral has died, maybe 10% if you really stretch the numbers ridiculously. That sounds like a lot of coral, but consider that between 2011 and 2016, the southern part of the Great Barrier Reef, the amount of coral increased by 250%. So the change of 5% or 10% downwards really doesn't add up to a hill of beans. Sediment is supposed to be smothering the reef, and this is one of my area of expertise, because I was actually involved with inventing the instruments that have measured sediment out on reefs. So my group has done more measurements of sediment on the reef than anybody else, and probably everybody else put together. Turns out that there's about 100 times more sediment that gets resuspended from waves and goes onto the reef than comes down all the rivers from all the farms put together. And it's that wave stirring that's most important. And of course, then you have cyclones. Well, they suspend so much sediment, it's just not funny. If you actually go out to the Great Barrier Reef, you're flat out even finding a single grain of sediment on the reef itself that comes from land. And you can tell whether it comes from land because the sediment on the reef is made out of broken down calcium carbonate, coral skeletons, totally different composition. And the sediment from land just isn't out there. Dredging is also supposed to be killing the reef, but in the last 2 decades, a couple of $100 million has been spent monitoring dredging operations to see how much it kills. And basically, apart from 1 or 2 in Western Australia where they actually dredge through a reef, you're flat out measuring even a single coral that dies in most of these things. And on that one where they did drill through the reef, they found that the effect of dredging goes maybe 2 or 3 kilometres. But most of the reefs on the Great Barrier Reef are, well, on average 1,000 kilometres from a particular port, and are almost always between 50 and 100 kilometres from the nearest port, so they really are not affected. Coral growth rates have increased by 10% since the 1940s. Pesticides never get out to the reef in quantities that would affect the reef. In fact, they're in such low quantities you can barely even measure them, even with the most accurate scientific instruments. Crown of thorns starfish are entirely natural, and sediment cores indicate that there have been plagues of them around for time immemorial. They are not like cats or tame cane toads. They are actually a native Australian species, just like a kangaroo or an echidna. Coral certainly fluctuates in coral cover over time, but the amount of coral that we've got now is not significantly different to when records properly started to begin in the 1985. But the scientific consensus is that the whole thing is on its last legs. And this is a big deal now if you're from North Queensland, because every single one of our major industries is affected by restrictions caused by the supposed demise of the Great Barrier Reef. Sugar, cattle, mining, port dredging, and the tourist industry, because the whole world knows that the reef is dead, so why bother coming? So the question is, how could this all be so wrong? It sounds like a bit of a crazy story, that so many scientists could be wrong, and I'm the only one. I'm not the only one, by the way, but I'm one of the few who thinks that this is all a load of rubbish. Well, I've actually got some bad news for you. This is not the only area where scientists get it wrong. Who here has heard of the replication crisis? Hands up. Who here has not heard of the replication crisis? All right. Well, frankly, shame on you, because it's the biggest thing in science in the last 40 years. But you do have an excuse, right? The replication crisis is where we're finding, when we try to repeat science that's already been done, we find it's wrong half the time, right? So this is why you've never heard of it, because scientists don't tend to like to blow the trumpet on this one too much. Can you imagine any other profession where it's wrong half the time? You know, perhaps flying an aeroplane. Aeroplanes only crash half the time. Right? Now, this is just not me saying this, all right? This is the big journals and the big national science organisations. We're talking about this. Possibly the most famous quote on this is by a chap called Horton in the leading medical journal, The Lancet. Very famous. He said, "The case against science is straightforward. Much of the scientific literature, perhaps half, may simply be untrue, afflicted by studies with small sample size, tiny effects, invalid exploratory analysis, flagrant conflicts of interest together with an obsession for fashionable ideas of dubious importance. Science has taken a turn towards darkness." And then John Ioannidis from Stanford University, who in my view is actually the father of the replication crisis, wrote a very famous paper which has been cited more than any other paper in the last few years, called "Why Most Published Findings Are False." He reckons that we're wasting about 85% of our science resources following bad science effectively down a rat hole. So yes, scientists can get it wrong, and they can get it a lot wrong, and a lot of scientists can get it all wrong on one particular thing without any problems. All right, so how did this get me into a spot of bother? Well, for the IPA, I wrote a chapter in the book on climate change and how climate change affects the reef, or doesn't affect the reef. The IPA organised an interview with the Alan Jones where I said the words to the effect that in the light of the replication crisis, which shows about a 50% failure rate, if organisations use solely peer review as their checking mechanism, then their results could not be trusted. 50% isn't trustworthy. Now, it was a tough thing that I said, and I named a couple of organisations, and I did not expect them to be particularly happy with that. I expected them to argue. You know, "Peter, you're wrong because," well, whatever. But what actually happened, well, I was called into my dean's office and given a brown envelope with allegations of serious misconduct. By the way, serious misconduct, the difference between serious and normal misconduct is you can be fired for serious. So they chose that one. They told to keep all the allegations secret. In my view, that was in total contravention of my work contract. I contacted the IPA just to let them know what was going on, and they were very generous and they gave me some legal help, and there was quite a bit of legal to and fro. JC was very insistent that everything was kept secret. The legal things were going pretty well for me, I thought, but then I got called up to the Dean's office a second time and given 25 more serious misconduct allegations, mostly for not keeping things secret. They trawled through my emails. They had no reason to do it. They trawled through my emails for dirt. They read every single one. And I can tell you that you start to sweat when you're reading a 128-page document of allegations which they've dredged from your emails. You wonder, well, what have I said? And when I got to the end of it, I breathed a huge sigh of release because I'd actually not said anything that I was ashamed of, which was a surprise. But some of the allegations were really incredible. They objected to me emailing my wife. In another email, this was emailing my wife about the allegations. In another email, I complained to a friend that the university was Orwellian for not allowing me free speech. So JCU then read my emails and complained that I was not that I was not allowed to call them Orwellian. I thought it must have been a joke, that they actually had some sorts of sense of humour, but actually they just didn't realise that they had proven themselves to be Orwellian and that Big Brother really was watching me. I'll show that they had a sense of humour a little bit as well. The case dragged on for some time, legal to and fro, and it was draining resources, but we decided to file in court to fight it, right? In my opinion, at that stage, the university wasn't expecting us to do that, and they certainly weren't expecting the fight or the really bad publicity that was coming about. So as soon as we filed, within a day or so, they gave me a final censure, your last thing, and told me to keep it secret. Except to my wife, they agreed that I could talk to her, which was nice of them. And I confess at first that I'd got away with it, right? Well, I hadn't been fired, and I really thought I was going to get fired. And I was inclined to accept it. The final censure, I'd kept my job. We'd fought the battle to a draw, and my wife disagreed, in fact. She said, "You are now silenced, and JCU has you where they want you to be, with a gun to your head, with the final censure, and a muzzle on your mouth." I couldn't really say anything without taking the risk that I was going to get fired. And she was dead right. Within a short time, I was supposed to give a talk at the Sydney Institute and the IPA, as I recall, and the JCU insisted on reading my PowerPoint presentations, and they asked for some parts to be removed and other parts to be modified. And when I did give the lecture at the Sydney Institute, some people asked some questions, and I found that I actually couldn't answer the questions because of the restrictions that had been placed on me. So we weighed this up for a little while, but in the end, there was just no choice. We had to fight. What they were doing was wrong, and we were going to fight it, even though we knew that this was going to raise the ire of JCU even more and take a considerable risk. So with the great assistance of the IPA, especially Matt Lesh over here, we went for a GoFundMe campaign to raise $100,000 for the required legal assistance. And we got that $100,000 in 2 days with a GoFundMe, which was fun. And there may be some people here. It was incredibly nerve-wracking, but it was also a bit exciting as well, right? Seeing the money rack up. Now, to do that, I had to put all the information on the website, everything. All the allegations, all 40-odd, at this stage, 27 charges against me. And I did that because, well, firstly, I have a right to do that, in my view. Secondly, the public have a right to know what a public university is doing with their money. And thirdly, you can't say to people who you're trying to get some money off, JCU has accused me for 27 counts of serious misconduct, please give me $100,000, but I can't tell you what it is about. Remember, these donors know I work at a university. I could have been touching up the first-year ladies. They need to know everything, so I have to, well, it's true, isn't it? That's what people think. We're talking about 27 cases of serious misconduct. People start to wonder, well, what has this guy done? And that's why I had to tell people, hey, guys, it's nothing bad, all right? I just said some things. All right, well, the GoFundMe campaign made JC really angry, especially as there was lots of very adverse publicity. So there was a third meeting with the Dean, and I was given another brown envelope with a dozen or so new allegations. Again, they claimed that I broke the illegal secrecy directive, and they trawled up other matters, all of which I put online so that other people could judge whether I was guilty or not. My favourite allegation was an email I sent to an old friend, an ex-college, with the subject line of the email, "For your amusement." And I attached a newspaper article about my case, which was fairly uncomplimentary to JCU. And I didn't say anything else, right? JCU claimed that for just sending that with "for your amusement," I'd broken the rule in our enterprise bargaining agreement that I'm not allowed to parody, vilify, or satirise the disciplinary process. And by saying "for amusement," I'd done that. I've never heard anything more pathetic in my life. I must say, I laughed when I read that one. Well, anyway, it dragged on more to and fro with the legal people, and I was finally fired. I was actually sitting under a palm tree in Bamaga on the tip of Cape York Peninsula when I got the phone call from the HR manager, And he was jolly nice about it. And he offered me counselling just in case I was a bit upset about things, right? So we said, to hell with that. We're going to go for another GoFundMe. We needed more cash, and we got $160,000 in 3 days. So thank you all for that much too. During the 10 months that this was going on, there was considerable media interest, which was almost all entirely unfavourable to the JCU. And I managed the incredible feat, I'm very proud of this, I managed to get Andrew Bolt to agree with the ABC. And also Breitbart to agree with the Guardian newspaper. That was how bad the publicity was for the university. Now, you may wonder why JCU was so keen to keep all the allegations secret, and you may think that it was because JCU might have think that it would reflect badly on them. But actually, by enforcing the secrecy provision, the illegal secrecy provision, the victim cannot get help and cannot organise resistance. The secrecy provision is a powerful tool to control the academics, or in this case, the proletariat, I guess. If I had not been able to talk to the IPA or do the GoFundMe campaign, I could never have got the legal help. I would have been fired much sooner, and I would have had no hope of fighting back. So that's why the secrecy provision we're fighting so hard, because it means that people can't fight back. I won't go into any much more detail on this. The court case will be held in mid-November. The court case will not be fought on common decency. If it was, I would win. I've no doubt about that. But it's on the legal definition of the enterprise bargaining agreement. I know I'm off by heart. 54.1.5, Section C is what it's going to be fought on. But anyway, we've got a good chance of success. We've got an excellent legal system, but it's not certain. All right, so what does this all mean? Well, that enterprise bargaining agreement does apply to other universities, or at least parts of it. So what will happen if I win? Well, actually, all it proves is that if you could raise 260 grand of other people's money with a huge amount of help from the IPA and lawyers, a lot of grey hairs and angst, you might get your job back. So what will other academics think? Well, they're going to say, whatever you do, don't do what Peter Ridd did, right? Just don't go towards the edge of that cliff. So academic freedom is thus effectively dead, although there'll be this fiction because the judge might have upheld my case. The process will be the punishment, and the administrators will have got their own way. On the other hand, if I lose, well, that'll be bad, but we will at least have a court proclaim, in my view, well, that's the death of academic freedom, because the university will have effectively written into the enterprise bargaining agreement that it is dead, but by these other provisions that they've put in. So we will know exactly where we stand, and to be frank, it's been pretty obvious for the last couple of decades that academic freedom has been dead. But we will have closure, as they say nowadays, and we can go ahead and bury the corpse. Academic freedom, born in Bologna 1088, on life support since 1990, pronounced dead in 2018, will be fondly remembered. So you might wonder, well, would the academics care? Well, not really. Remember, about 80% of the academics, at least, would be on the cultural left. Of the remainder, maybe only 10%, mostly in the engineering and hard science area, would be working in potentially, not in those areas, would be working in potentially controversial fields. So they're not worried. So of those 2%, of the remaining 2%, there'll only be a few who will firstly have sort of the personality to fight, will have no mortgage and good superannuation. Now, I'm at the end of my career, so it doesn't really matter. People say it's brave. It's not brave. I'm near the end. I'm near retirement. In fact, there's a responsibility for people in my position to take these risks. But anyway, what you end up with is about 1 in 1,000 academics who are actually effective and willing to fight to do anything about it. So don't expect a groundswell from the academics. So the big question, is academic freedom already dead in name? Well, probably. Do we give up on universities being the main font of our original thoughts and cradles of vigorous debate? And is it now, in fact, the blogs and the new media which are doing that? Well, in most fields, I think that is absolutely true. But in the sciences where I am, where you need money to actually do this research, and I've been doing this for 25 or 30 years and come to these conclusions, you still need a decent university, and we don't have that. And we've also got the terrible problem that everybody talks about, that we are still entrusting our children to these people, and that's a big problem. So universities are definitely no longer a net benefit to the society. We really do need to reform them. I have some ideas about how to do that. Well, anyway, I want to leave on a sort of an upbeat note. So remember, the Great Barrier Reef is fine. It's actually bloody marvellous. So tell people that. Tell your children, because I know that there's a lot of very depressed children who have been told at their school that the thing's dead, and they're actually depressed about it, and it's not. And also, wish me luck in November. Thank you very much.